think back to 2011. What's the hottest new Pokemon on the block? It's Zorua. And the reason why is because of its ability Illusion, that appears as the last Pokemon in the party until it takes direct damage. Everybody thinks it's going to be a broken ability, because how can you tell when your opponent's using a Zorua? Isn't that going to be so broken? But then it introduced as well is Team Preview, rendering this ability pretty moot. As a result, Zorua has been considered exceedingly unviable for quite a few generations, especially in mainline Black and White, where it doesn't even appear on the viability rankings. But why am I talking about this now? Because, I mean, that should be old news by now. That's Black and White. What about in Scarlet and Violet? What's going on now? As it turns out, Zorua was A- here in the current viability rankings. So what changed? What made this imposter into a crewmate? I'm going to go over what made Zorua good in Scarlet and Violet. Alright, so if anybody's wondering, alright, so where are you getting the sets for Zorua from? The answer is me. I'm the one making these sets. I'm the one who's tested out Zorua. It's pretty crazy. And I'll also make sure to go over some replays as well, so you can be like, oh, well, you're just talking theory. No, I've done it in practice. So first and foremost, what is Zorua doing? Well, it's going to use knockoff, and the reason why that's important is because, like, oh, well, you have, like, Tink and you have Toedscool. Why not just use them? Because they both have knockoff. Well, that's because if you look at the knockoff distribution, there are 7 Mons, and Zorua is one of them. Tink and Toedscool are also in the VR. Wingull, Shroodle, Ralts, and Makuhita aren't for the express role of, like, a knockoff user. Shroodle's on there because of Prankster, not because of knockoff. But what separates Zorua from Tink and from Toedscool is a much higher attack stat. So if we look at Toedscool, it's got an attack stat of 40. If we look at Tink, 45. With a good amount of investment, it gets up to 13. But then if we look at Zorua, it has base 65. Tink has to invest almost, in Little Cup terms, this would be about 2 stat points. Has to invest 2 stat points worth of stuff that you can invest into HP, defense, all this other stuff. And it's going to be a lot of investment. Just that way it can tie Zorua, and even then, it's not going to be as effective as a knockoff user, because Zorua has Dark Stab. So every time it uses knockoff, it's going to have an additional 1.5 times boost. And it removes the item. And you're probably thinking, well, why is knockoff so important? I don't understand. It's good in the upper tiers, but it's not exceedingly important. Well, the reason for that is because Eviolite is everywhere. And Eviolite boosts your defense and special defense by 1.5 times. So what that means is that if you manage to knock something off, then they're essentially playing with a close combat debuff for the rest of the game. They have -1 to defense, -1 to special defense, and they can't get it back ever. In addition to having a really strong knockoff on baseline with the 1.5 times damage boost. So it'll always do the same amount of damage if your opponent has Eviolite, because they have a 1.5 times defense boost. You have the 1.5 damage boost, so it's just going to even out. So before and after knockoff, you're going to be doing the same amount of damage. However, because you can remove the knockoff, that means that all of your other moves are going to be doing more damage, and it can be really helpful for opening up Mons in the late game. And it was seen really often for a lot of, from Generation 6 onwards, it's basically mandatory on if you have knockoff, you use knockoff. It wasn't mandatory in Black and White because it was only 20 base power, but 65, now we're talking. Well, what else makes Zorua good? Because, I mean, like, these guys have knockoff, it has Thunder Wave and Stealth Rock, that's really valuable. I mean, you can slow down your opponent, weaken them with knockoff, and then also cripple your opponent on switching with Stealth Rock. Toedscool has a whole bunch of stuff. It can do Earth Power as pretty good stab. It also has Rapid Spin to remove hazards. It also has Spore Support. So what makes Zorua so good? Sucker Punch. Stab Sucker Punch. It's going to be hitting surprisingly hard. And it's even better when your opponent doesn't expect it because you have Illusion. Pretty nice. Finally, you have U-turn, so if your opponent's like, oh, I know, this is actually a Zorua in disguise. I used my 5,000 IQ in order to figure this out. Alright, well, I can just U-turn on your Tink coming in, and then I go to, like, my Diglett, and now your Tink's dead. So, eat that victory rail. But because of that, these 3 moves having such good utility on baseline, knock off, removing items, Sucker Punch for good, powerful priority, and then U-turn to gain momentum off of your opponent, making what they thought was an obvious switch. It also works pretty well. I'm going to go into a small little interaction, but like, if you are disguised as a Quaxley, and I'll get into why you'll want to in a bit, But you're like, oh yeah, I could just be a Quaxley. That's a-okay. And then your opponent, wanting to counter the Quaxley, goes to Marionade, which is pretty standard. Marionade takes Quaxley's hits really well. Resists liquidation. You get not too much damage from Brave Bird because of how good your defense stat is. Pretty standard. Well, what if that Quaxley's just a Zorua in disguise, and they're thinking, oh, well, I'll just go to Marionade. Well, no. They either get A, knocked off, meaning that Marionade is no longer a reliable check to Quaxley, or anywhere near as reliable of a check to Quaxley because it's knocked off, or it can U-turn out, go into something more important like Toedscool to threaten the Marionade with Earth Power, still keep threatening a knockoff, or, as I mentioned before, go into a Diglett. It's such a powerful tool in its kit, despite the fact that it's not even stab. It's so good. And the final thing that makes you so valuable is Terra Blast fighting. In many generations beforehand, what would happen is that Pawnyard would just hard wall you, even with the coverage of something like a mix set where you can run extra sensory, to hit fighting types. It's not going to hit Pawnyard. Pawnyard was just such a roadblock. How are you going to get over this? Well, the simple answer is you just Terra Blast fighting it and it dies. That's it. But now your biggest weakness is now a liability for your opponent, because what happens if they're going into something like a Toedscool or a Quaxley or something that it would normally check exceedingly well, but then it's actually secretly a Zorua in the back with Terra Blast fighting. That means that Pawnyard is significantly less reliable and is really scared out by the Terra Blast. Really annoying. Also, you have 2 additional Scarf sets. You have Pure Physical. Oh, that's not what it should be. It's... my bad. Alright, but you run this kind of set on a physically based Zorua Scarf because you want a hard knockoff, having 16 attack, really good. But then you also have U-turn to, once again, gain momentum. Then you have Trick. And Trick's used for crippling stuff like Marionade, and you're thinking, oh, what does that mean exactly? I don't understand what you mean by crippling the wall with a scarf. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that if you trick a Marionade a scarf, it's going to have a significantly harder time doing what it wants to do. And what it wants to do is that it wants to sit there, it wants to use moves like Recover, Sludge Bomb, Surf, Haze, and if they're locked into either Recover or Haze, it's going to be a significantly harder time for it to get much progress at walling the enemy at all. You want to be able to switch moves. So, for example, Quaxley versus Marionade, you want to be able to recover off your damage, as well as Sludge Bomb, as well as Haze. And the reason for that is Recover to keep yourself healthy so you can keep taking Quaxley hits, Sludge Bomb to deal damage to Quaxley and possibly poison it, and then Haze to remove the speed boost and possible Moxie boosts. And because it has this Choice Scarf, it's locked into one move, and it can't do that reliably. In addition to losing its Eviolite. Always really nice. And then, obviously, Terra Blast fighting. You can also run a specially offensive Zorua, and the reason that you would do that is because Extra Sensory is so good. Instead of just tricking away your Choice Scarf, you just kill the Marionade with an Extra Sensory. That also applies to Brawler. Because you're super fast, you outspeed things like Giraffe Rig or other Scarf Mons because you get up to 17. So even Pawnyard, which even if you look at the sample sets for Pawnyard, yep. Sample sets for Pawnyard, one of the things that you can do is a Choice Scarf set. And because this reaches 16 and you reach 17, you're faster. Also, you have a pretty nice Terra Blast. You think it's not all that useful? It surprisingly is. Like, even having just an 80 base power special type move, it's normal type, to bonk things neutrally. And then also if they're like, oh, well, I could possibly force out a Terra or whatever. But just having that as a kind of okay stab, it can mess over a few months quite a bit. But now you're thinking, alright, so that means that Zorua itself is pretty alright. But what about Illusion? Illusion's is a really big selling point. What makes Illusion so good? What can you disguise as in this meta that are actually really nice? Well, I have them. First and foremost, Brawler, it's the premier fighting type, and one of the big things that makes Zorua so good is actually if we go over to the viability rankings, and we look for, well, where's the first fighting type? It's Brawler at B+. Nothing above it. It's all Giraffe Rig, which is a psychic type, which you pair up really well against, Diglett, which is really frail, Mudbray, which hates being knocked off, Toedscool, which hates being knocked off, Ghastly, which you pair up really well against. Glimmet's kind of neutral. Quaxley hates losing his Eviolite because it's supposed to be a physical wall. Surskit, it's kind of neutral because it can hit you with Bug Buzz, but if it Terra ghosts, then you can just knock it off and it'll die. Magnemite's kind of but Crabrawler though, isn't Crabrawler pretty big of an issue, as well as Nimble? Not really, surprisingly. Like, obviously it still will be if it's 1v1, but because you have Illusion and 5 other Mons on your team, you can do a lot of stuff just by disguising yourself as a Crabrawler. They're thinking, oh, well, I gotta go into my Giraffe Rig in order to be able to deal with the opposing Crabrawler because I'm faster, and then I also have a nasty plot set, so I can attack into the Crabrawler really well. It'll be fine. And then they get knocked off, and then they get sucker punched, and then the Giraffe Rig dies. So what's it gonna do now? You can also disguise as Toedscool. As I mentioned before, you can do knockoff shenanigans. You knock off into your opponent. You can't tell if it's Toedscool or Zorua. I'm not as partial to this, just because your opponent knows, like, oh, well, they're gonna be knocking off into me. And I'll get into why that's important in a sec. You could also do Diglett to be really cheeky because people think, ah, darn, I'm arena trapped. What am I gonna do? The answer is die. They can't switch. I have a video going over Diglett as well. And then Quaxley, finally gonna return to why do you want to disguise as Quaxley? Like, at least with Toedscool, you can match their speed stats, make it even harder for your opponent to tell. So why is Quaxley such an important thing that you can disguise as? And that's all due to Rapid Spin. In my previous video, I had went over the impacts of Rapid Spin and why it's so good. So, you really want to get those off very often, especially on a Quaxley and Toedscool because they can spiral out of control really easily, making your opponent have to waste a lot of resources, like 1.5 Mons, possibly 2, just to be able to stop it. So, if they're trying to block your Rapid Spin, what are they going to go into? Well, they want to go into a ghost type, like a Ghastly, you know? Or they're going to Terra Ghost, so that way they get to keep their hazards up. But what happens if that Quaxley isn't a Quaxley at all? I've done this before, it's great. I'm Legendary Third Alt, I'm the one with the Zorua, and I'm facing up against a Webs team. This is Surskit. What Surskit does is that it sets up Sticky Web. That's its job. Then you also pair it with a Ghastly or do Terra Ghost on it yourself, so that way you can block Rapid Spin. So, what are you going to do? So obviously you want to lead with Quaxley, because you're expecting me to go to, like, Toedscool or something. I go to Marionette, they Rapid Spin, keep on going. Most important thing, Surskit comes in here, and what's Surskit going to do? So I want to explain this play real quick. So Surskit really wants to set Sticky Web, so in order to prevent the Surskit from setting Sticky Web as effectively, as well as not going into my Toedscool, because Toedscool often dies to Surskit. Surskit runs Ice Beam, Icy Wind, etc. in order to specifically for Toedscool. So that can be a really bad decision. But if I go into Quaxley instead, Quaxley can Rapid Spin really comfortably versus Surskit. So Surskit wants to get out of there and go into Ghastly, so that way the Rapid Spin that's coming in gets blocked. So you're obviously going to switch to Ghastly here. But what if that's not actually Quaxley? What if that's Zorua? And now throughout the rest of the game, they're going to be down an extra Mon that they didn't have to sacrifice due to a bad play that they couldn't always predict. Because it's a 50-50 of, well, do I let them get the spin? Do I attack into them in case they're Zorua? You don't know. But then Pawnyard comes in and is like, oh, well, it's obviously Zorua. But then it just dies to a Terra less fighting. So there you go. Now your opponent's down to Surskit, which is functionally exceedingly useless on webs, because once it sets Sticky Web, it just dies. It's not very much of an offensive threat. So what's it going to do now? They're going to have a pretty well chipped down Quaxley, in addition to it being poisoned, so it's going to be on a timer. And then they have Crabrawler, but all that's not going to really do all that much in the end, in the main scheme of things. So what's going to go on? Now they're down to all of that, and what have I lost? I've used up my Terra. Everything on my team is still healthy. Marionette took some chip from a Quaxley earlier, but it's fine because it's got Regenerator. So all that's happened is that I've taken a little bit of chip and gotten Sticky Web up, which I can really easily spin off because there's no spin blocker on the opponent's team. So there you go. It's all so good, and Zorua's got me so much advantage just because your opponent has to play around it. And it's really hard to do that. And you're thinking, oh, this is a one-off thing. I did it twice. That's right, I did it twice. So then if I go to... Alright, so here. Gotta go to this turn specifically because what is my opponent thinking that they're gonna do? So this is likely a Scarf Magnemite based on the fact that they've gotten 3 steals. Why are you running 3 steals? Huh. But they have 3 steals, and they've just gone into Magnemite. So, locked into Thunderbolt, assumedly. So what am I going to do now? Well, the most logical thing to do would just be go into Toedscool. Why not? It's your ground type. It's going to be able to deal with the Magnemite, as well as get rocks off. So, you know, that's a pretty logical thing. And then you can probably Rapid Spin here in order to get rid of your rocks. So that way your entire team isn't chipped down. Giraffe Rig doesn't like it. Zorua's not going to like it. Marionette's not going to like it all that much. So, you know, pretty logical play. So in order to not get annoyed by this Toedscool, well, I'm just going to go Drifloon and keep my rocks up. It's fine. No, you're not. This is actually a Zorua. So you just deal too much damage. And they're like, oh, well, it's probably still just like a very offensive Toedscool. Oh, well, that's probably it. No, I just Sucker Punch you, and now you're dead. This is what I mean about pairing up really well versus Giraffe Rig. Doing 60% against a Mon with 70 HP and 65 defense is very rare. And it's just so good here because of how much progress I got. I killed the Drifloon. I killed the Giraffe Rig. Didn't even do any damage to me. And then it's like, oh, well, I know it's Zorua now. And then this dies too. So I've gotten 3 kills from Zorua. No, he gets slapped here, but that's fine. But 3 kills. And now my opponent's having to play with 3 Mons down when they could have just gone into Pawnyard there, forced the Terra, and then be able to, like, do some stuff with Giraffe Rig. Like, oh, that would have been perfectly fine. But now they can't because Zorua was too good. The Zorua broken now. It's A- on the tier list because of how good it is. It's so absurd. And that's what makes it so good, is that because you have these 2 brand new really good Rapid Spinners, Toedscool, we have Quaxley, and they really easily invite in ghost types that they just keep on getting bonked. In addition to the fact that Crabrawler is basically the only fighting you're ever going to see. Now, obviously you can still have like Terra fighting Giraffe Rig, and you have to play around that. But when your checks are very limited, it's going to really give you a boost. It's not perfect because, I mean, you still die to Nimble really easily, and then Take a Tank takes her attacks exceedingly well, and then Pawnyard blocks you if you don't have Terra. But it's just become so much better because of all the things that make it, like, all the things standing in its way beforehand are just gone. There's no sign of them anymore. Because if we go to, like, Sword and Shield, you aren't using it. Why is that? That's because Minfu is everywhere. It's the tier king. Everybody loves running Minfu. You have to run a fighting type. It's either Minfu or Timber. And Minfu just crushes Zorua so hard, it's unbelievable. Look at, like, 85 attack, and then you have high jump kick. You're not going to be able to deal with that. But you don't exist, Scarlet and Violet. The limited decks made Zorua wonderful. And it's just really nice to see. Because finally, the Zorua that we all thought was going to be absurd and broken has finally gotten up to the place where it belongs. Thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you really, really, really like my content, then if you would please like, share, and subscribe, I'd very much appreciate it. Thank you very much for taking some time out of your day to watch me. And this is Shreddy Shryman signing out. Have a good day.